Hi, I'm Marina from frocksandfrolics.com. Welcome to another part of the Charlie Brown coat, which we're sewing with the Ottobre magazine. And in this particular video, we are going to do bound buttonholes because I think they're really, really cool. No need to be scared of those. They look way better than anything you could do with a domestic sewing machine. So let's get started. And here you can see we have 3 buttonholes just on this side. On the other side, we are just attaching the buttons, so they're going to be fake. So all we need to do is 3 buttonholes. And I have decided what size I want. Those are not the buttons that are going to go on there, but I know the size of the buttons. So if I measure that, I get 2.5 centimeters. That is an inch, and what I want is to have it 5 mil bigger. So my buttonholes are going to be 3 centimeters wide. That's really important that you know what size you need to make your buttonhole. And how the buttonhole is on here is a little bit too small. That's only 2 centimeters, so I need a whole centimeter more than that. And because I'm going to put my buttonholes not on the right side, but on the left side as you look at it, because I'm making it for a girl, I need to first draw my markings through to the other side so they get to be put in on the side that they need to be on, which is the left, right? As you're looking at it. And for a boy, it would be the other side. So now when I put this on, I can see where they're actually going to go. I always like to put it on the fabric. You don't really have to do that. The first thing to do is to connect that line there. So I've got a straight line in the front, very important. And then I'm going to measure the 3 centimeter I want for my buttonhole, and I go down here and I mark 3 centimeters for that on here. Make sure that this is straight and all lining up. It's very important you do this really super duper well to get these wonderful buttonholes. So mark it there and move over to the next one. Of course, you could just move on to the last one and then connect the lines. That would also be good. You know, there's no need necessarily to do that, but because I do the vertical lines as well, it makes sense for me to do it. Make sure it's all straight. Draw your line. Now I need to draw my boxes. I want each lip to be 0.7 centimeters wide. So the whole thing altogether will be 1.4 centimeters wide. If you make them not wide enough, it looks a little bit, you know, poxy really. So you want to now do the 0.7 mil to either side. And again, make sure that you do it nice and straight and that you line everything up. And we're going to do that on all 3 of them, and then that's done. Next, we're going to take our facing and we're going to put that over the top, and then we're going to mark them through. Now, you might say, why not just use the part for the shell fabric, that pattern piece, for all of it? But you actually want the facing to be slightly bigger than the outside, because otherwise your buttonhole is going to be a little bit too tight. With all the fabric, that's just what it does. So what you want to do is draw that buttonhole through, but you go a little bit further up. So you've got it 1 or 2 mil tops bigger. And then we do the same on the other side. We just go that little bit further than what we need to have. And we do the same, obviously, on all the other lines as well that are now vertical to us. So I'll go down here as well, 1 millimeter bigger than it is. So the whole buttonhole is going to be 1.4 wide and 3.2 long instead of the 3 centimeters in length and the 1.4 centimeter in width. And when I've drawn this all through, the next step will then be to cut all of those out. I will then make a template for myself so that I can just transfer that to the fabric. And don't forget that if you're making the coat just 1 or 2 sizes bigger, you very likely will use a very similar button position. So you can use this template again, even if you have drawn out the pattern again for a different size. These are good to have. I would stash those away. Even if you never ever make this again, you can use the buttonholes for other jackets as well, because I think they're really nice distance from each other. And in fact, they were the right distance for me as well. Now, the one thing you do want to do is put your facing over your upper part here and see, is it a little bit bigger all the way around? Have you done it correctly? And if you have, you can get started transferring what you've done onto your fabric. And so what I'm going to do now is take that piece and put it over, and then I'm just going to draw through the corners, and then afterwards I can draw that on, and I use for all of that pencil. It's really important that the pattern piece lies totally on the edges. That is important, and then you can draw the corners in. And then afterwards we will just connect all of that to make sure it's all nice and straight. Lovely. So take it back off and now start drawing them in. We're doing exactly the same. Now, one thing I will say is, because I top stitched these as well all the way around, I did find that my buttonhole was a wee little bit too close to the edge. So I would advise you to go in about 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters in even, so that you're not so close to the edge. You can see here the seam allowance shining through, and you can clearly see it is very close to the edge. And once you top stitch around it, it won't look so nice. I mean, mine came out beautiful. You can see it blended in here, but I would just give you that word of advice. Just move your buttonhole a little bit over from what you suggested, and then you draw that through as well on the facing. Now comes the really exciting part. We're just going to put a light piece of fabric. It doesn't have to be blue. This is just what I had. It doesn't really matter too much about the color. And we're placing it right underneath it so that you cover the buttonholes. And then I'm going to put a few pins along it, so I don't need to move them out when I'm sewing. And we're going to stitch those little rectangles. Just make sure it's nicely on there, and then we're going to go around here with a stitch length of 1 or just above it. So pretty small stitches, so nothing can tear out later. And for my shell fabric, make sure that the nap runs the right way, and then you put the right sides facing your lips or welts, that fabric for it, underneath it. Move it over. Put it on nice and straight so that it covers. And then all you have to do, again, put some pins in. And then we're going to sew those in. And the same applies. If you use this really small stitch length, it won't fray. Now, on a brushed wool like this, fraying is not an issue at all. But you might do it in a fabric where the weave is more pronounced. It's not brushed, it's not felted or anything like that. And in that case, it's mega important that the stitch length is 1. Otherwise, it could fray in the corners, which is not what you want. So you go right down to where you have got your corner, and with a needle in the fabric, you turn and sew down, and then needle in the fabric, turn again. Now, one thing is important when you start is that you don't reverse stitch there, because you're going to end up with a little jig, and that might then not look so good. The finer the fabric you use, the more obvious that will be. So when we get back to the point where we started, we will just overrun it by about 5 mil or something, or even a little bit longer. It doesn't matter too much, as long as you stay on exactly the same stitching line. That's effectively like doing a reverse stitch, and you will not have that little jig, which might make that line thicker. And now we rinse and repeat and do the same thing for the front as well. And we're sewing all the way around, again with that shorter stitch length. And as you seeing me do it here, you can see where the seam allowance is because we cut that back from my interfacing, and you can see that it's awfully close to the edge. You do want to go for at least 1.5 centimeters off the edge with that. And for my fabric and my buttons, I would have gone almost 2 centimeters to the side, or 1.8, just because I didn't want that big button to hang over the edge, which is not a good look. You don't want that. And we work all the way around again. It's a very simple technique, and I'm currently also slowly, so it might be a while, working on another course for my classic coat, the Charlotte coat, and that will have the welt buttonholes again, but I will show them as they are done in a slightly more complicated way, where you sew on the lips and turn it. That is not very beginner friendly, whereas this is, I think, the first method you should learn. It makes it really easy, and where applicable you can do it. And if you want to learn how to do the other method, you can then watch that once that comes out. If you want to know how to do a proper welt pocket, which is the same as this, then you can visit the Sewing Academy at frocksandfrolics.com, and I have a whole course on pockets, and you can just watch all those versions on there as well. Now we're just going to cut it open. So you cut a slit into it, and then you cut right into the corner. Don't be tempted to stop before the corner. You need to be right on that point in all directions, and then we can turn those through, because we've cut them apart. You did spot that, I hope. So we can just turn them then and press that thing. There we go. That corner as well. Lovely. And now you take your fabric and you turn it. I've learned something actually, never film something in navy blue. It was either too dark or it was too bright. So when I do the classic coat, I'm going to do a lighter fabric. But I hope you can see it really well anyway. So now I'm turning it, just a rectangle. Now you could iron the seam apart here and have half of the seam going into the lip. That works too. I'm not doing it here because it's simply easier. You don't need to do that. And I'm just forming my lips now. So they need to sit in the center, so they're basically touching each other and even to both sides. But before I do that, I will actually give that a good press, and I'll show you that in a minute. So now we're cutting all the rest open in exactly the same manner. Go to the corner, and then we can move over to the ironing board and do it all properly. Now they're all in, the next thing to do is to push them all through. And now I'm going to press it. And the first thing to do is press it exactly open so that you get a really neat edge all the way around. It just makes it easier for when you do the lip. And then I form my lip and I press it again. There's a lot of ironing in this whole coat. You will see as we go on that I'm ironing all the steps, and that's so important because otherwise you don't end up with a beautiful result like I did. And I really want you to learn this so that you can make the most beautiful coats, which really are worthwhile doing at home, because people will say, oh my goodness, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. To be honest, I think this coat is one of the most beautiful coats I've ever made. Not just because the pattern is so good, and actually it is a very good pattern, but I also took my time on doing it all really well. And I am sorry this is way too dark for you to see. What I'm doing is evening out all my lips so that they look really nice. And when I'm happy with it, then I give it a good press from the outside. And here we've got that triangle that you usually would sew down. Now you don't have to do that with this method. You just trim it off so it's nice and flat. And then I repeat the same thing with all the other ones. And then I'm going to top stitch all the way around. And I'm using a really thick, nice, lovely top stitching thread. And for that, I'm choosing a top stitching needle. And this needle is special because it's not just big, but it has a really big eye, and because of that the thread will not rub on it and then break. So you do need one of those to sew this. And we're going to use the top stitching thread only for the upper thread. The bobbin thread remains the same blue thread that I've got in there. So let's go thread this up, and now I'm going to stitch around. Now what I forgot to do is to put my stitch length higher, and it's I think on 2.5, which is a little bit poxy. So once I started though, I didn't change it. So I would advise you to go to 3, find a fixed point on your machine, and then stitch very close to the edge all the way around. A good thing to do is to try not to do half stitches, but going full stitches over the edge, otherwise it doesn't look very good. And if you find that your machine lets out stitches, you can always pull those stitches back afterwards to like pretend that there was no left out stitches. I wouldn't stop and do it again. The machine will do it off and on just because it's a household machine and can't really be helped. Also, you want to make sure that your tension is on 8 or 9, so really tight actually, so that it moves nicely and gives you a good stitch. There we go. So not too much, and then I did all of those, and then I decided I'm going to put another stitch around it, and I would say that would have looked really nice, but because I'm so close to the edge, I in the end took them back out. Now we're just stitching to where we started. Again, there is no reverse stitching, please don't do that. We're going to sew those away, and here you can see I'm stitching around again. I think that's really pretty, but it made it look as if I was literally on the edge, so I took it all back out so when I was done. But I did that literally when the coat was finished, and you live and learn. I think one stitch around is absolutely fine. If I had moved over my buttonhole, that 2-3 mil inwards, then I probably would have left those because they looked quite nice. Of course, you have more to pull away and also then sew away. So what you want to do now is pull all your threads to the underside, which will take you a little while, but it's worthwhile doing. And once you've got them all there, I knot them first and then I just pull them away. So put a double knot into your threads. I just connected the ones that come out, in the same area. I probably could have like knotted the other ones at the same time, do like 2 and 2. But I didn't do that. I did it all like nicely, like you should. So I do that on all of them. And then I need a sewing needle with a very big eyelet again. And then I'm just going to pull it away and cut it off. And that's basically it. So we repeat this process on all the other 3, and then we're actually done with that. Looking good. Next, we don't really need any of the other fabric that goes around it. And we can trim our buttonholes back now because we really only need a tiny little bit more than where we have the stitching. So I'm cutting it off all the way around. And you can also trim anything that you think might give you additional thickness. So that is where you have a fold, etc. And the corners can be cut off as well. You want to do this pretty neatly here. Cut those corners where you have a fold off as well. It's very thick fabric, so the more it's layered, the better it will look in the end. Right, rinse and repeat on the other ones as well. And now I'm taking a wet cloth and I'm putting that over, and I'm leaving my iron until it's really dry, right? And all the wetness, all the steam has gone into my fabric, and that will give you the flattest of finishes, just as if you had a professional press. Take it off and immediately put on your weight and really press down. And you leave that on until the steam no longer comes off it and you get a beautiful, really flat result. And we're basically going to do that through all the bits which are a bit thicker and do it like that. And now I'm going to do this exactly the same way. I cut my facings for the buttonholes apart, and then I just fiddle them through to the underside. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to iron it so we have that little rectangle standing, and that's then the lining for our buttonhole. Now, I will say though, if you have really thick material, I could have gotten away with just stitching around what I had marked without putting anything on it and not lining it, because when you have a felted fabric, it doesn't really fray. And this makes it quite thick. So if I did it again in the same fabric, I would have just stitched around with stitch length 1 or 1.5 at the most, or somewhere in between. And then I would have cut that back and just folded it back. That would have worked as well because the stitching will hold it. If you have a fabric that could fray, then this is the method to use, definitely. So that's something I've learned actually for this thickness, especially since I have a household sewing machine. I have, of course, in my industrial setting, when I had my workshop, I had an industrial sewing machine, and it would all not have made any odds. And I had a professional press as well. And so none of these things matter. But when you have a household machine, everything becomes a little bit more difficult, and you want to make it easy for yourself with your household equipment. So if you're using a felted fabric like I have, you don't really need to line it. But you do need to sew around it though. You don't get around that and then cut it and then just form the lips back. And if you want to, you can then top stitch it again as well, just in blue all the way around to hold it in place. And again here, what I will do is use my wet cloth or my damp cloth. Of course, it's not soaking wet. I wrung it out and then put it on. And again, I wait until it sort of comes away dry, move it off, and immediately take my weight and pop it on there and press it down until there is no more steam coming up from it. That's absolutely beautiful. And then I can put them on top of each other, and that really concludes it already. This is the first part of making the coat, and the next chapter will be the pockets, and I'll be back in a couple of days for that. And it looks absolutely stunning. And I tell you what, these look so much better than putting a buttonhole in with your sewing machine, especially at the thickness of this fabric. You're never going to get it looking like this. And again, just go in a few more millimeters to have your buttonhole knot right on the edge. And this looks stunning. As you can also see blended in, it is a beautiful coat. So I'm hoping to see you back here in a couple of days where we're going to put the pockets in. Bye for now.